Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the Simgot Dream. This one is the one dynamic driver, 8 balanced armatures, one piezo, sort of the big brother to SM4, but I think they're different sets, but essentially they came out in a very similar time span, so they seem like brothers, but I think they're actually quite different. So this is the side of it. So on the It's actually a quite large box, and we'll kind of move it out of the way, but not going to open it. There's not a whole lot inside of it. It's really nice packaging, but inside you'll essentially get the important stuff, which are the shells, which look like this. So again, very nice looking Simgot style shells, different faceplate. This one says Dream on it, but on the side we get the EM10, one dynamic driver, 8 balanced armatures, one piezo. Very nice kind of board nozzle, so really well done, really high quality build as you would expect. Inside of the box you do get the Simgot case, which you've seen before, and the cable this time is a SPC style cable, 2 cores, but has the gold foil kind of wrap around it. So a little different than what some of the other ones that they've done with the, I think, the silver foil. This one is modular as well, so you get the 4.4 and you get the 3.5, and you can actually stick them both up there. So that's the way I tend to keep them. So cool. Nice case. You've seen that one before. Let's kind of jump right into it. And we'll start at the most subjective of all subjective questions that we have in the hobby. Is it worth the money, right? Is this one's $400 and something. Is it worth it? What do you expect at that price point? And if you're expecting a set that's 4 times better than SM4, that rarely ever happens. I think as you spend more money, you get a diminishing return on your investment, and that's sort of no different with these. And it's certainly a better set, but if you're expecting something that's 4 times better, it's usually not going to happen. Usually I look for more resolve, parts that are missing or parts that are hard to hear on single dynamic drivers or lower BA style sets. That's tend to what I look for when you get a set that hits a dollar price point like this one does, or it has 8 balanced armatures like this one does. There should be something different, something noticeable when you're running through your favorite tracks. I don't necessarily dwell on the single test track that says, jump to 1 minute, 36 seconds. The guy shifts his weight, his shoelace, hits the ground. Did you hear it? I don't tend to do that, but I tend to notice when things are more audible or are missing. And if you go back and look what I said about Pilgrim, that a lot of that review was really about that point. It was an expensive set, around the same price as this one, but it didn't necessarily resolve the way I was expecting to at the price point. So definitely a fun set, definitely had nice drivers, but when you get down to what does resolve actually mean, this combination of really nice drivers and a tuning that is revealing, that one had a tuning which wasn't necessarily as revealing as I thought it was going to be. So you could also get the opposite of that. You can get a set like Cadenza 4, which was a very revealing tuning, but had a lower BA count, driver count, and it wasn't as revealing in that way either. So when you get into EM10, when you get into 8 balanced armature style sets, there should be this combination of a really nice tuning that is also revealing. So it actually sounds like there are more balanced armatures, there is more details, there's more resolution, there's kind of more technicalities are all there. All those things should sort of jump out somewhere in your normal day-to-day tracks, as opposed to finding test tracks to find that one certain thing. Generally, you should be noticing things that are harder to hear, especially on dynamic drivers. They don't tend to do some of those things all that well. So that is sort of what I look for. I think EM10 hits that mark in that way, and we'll kind of jump into it in that respect. And I'll say EM10 versus SM4 and why their views are going to get super confusing. On the objective side, like I just said, what is the justification, and objectively, why is EM10 different than SM4? Because it's technically better. As I said, SM4 and Dusk, they try to close the gap to higher BA sets. But then when you're given a higher BA set like EM10 with 8 balanced armatures, there's still a gap there. And as I said, EM10 has 8 balanced armatures and one piezo, and it actually sounds like it, like I was just talking about. There are going to be parts of those tracks. There are breaths in Adele songs, Taylor Swift songs. If you listen to Alanis Morissette, that intro to you ought to know that drum and listen to how much information is actually being played back versus an 8 balanced armature set versus a 1 dynamic driver. It's quite a bit different, and those are the things that I tend to look for. And I think EM10 hits that mark as far as being able to play back a resolution and a amount of resolve that is justified with the price point and the driver count. I think it actually hits that mark. If you are a resolving BA type, like I was just talking about, you'll gravitate towards the EM10. If you just want to buy the one that is the better value, that is undoubtedly going to be SM4, because again, it's not going to hit this 4 times better than SM4, but it is better. But it's always hard to objectively or quantifiably say, well, it's 4 times better or worth the price, all that stuff. That's really hard. It usually never happens. But yeah, I think objectively, I don't think people are going to say that EM10 isn't more resolving than SM4. I think everyone would agree on that. But subjectively, which one is warmer, colder, more musical, brighter? I think that is very complicated with this set. Both are very sensitive to impedance. So your source impedance and your source tonality, whether your dongle is warmer or colder, those things are going to heavily influence this set. And the source impedance is a heavily influence on the sound of this set, and that's going to affect the warmth and the overall bass presence. So we'll take a quick look at what this looks like. And I'm not going to talk too much about the graph, because the graphs for SM4 and EM10 are essentially the Harman target. The foundation of their house tuning for these particular sets is Harman 2019, so they follow Harman 2019 very closely. As I said, with Supermix 4, pretty much follows the line exactly. That is the one in the blue. The one in the red is EM10. Is there actually a gap there in a bass? It actually sounds like it to me, but I don't. If you look at the back of their box, I think they're both about at the same level on bass from Harman 2019. And then this is all the same as well from Harman 2019. But when I say that Supermix and EM10 are very sensitive to source impedance, this is exactly what I mean. So I measure on sort of low impedance devices, not near zero, or I do listen on not near zero, but my ES100 I think is about 0.5, or it's in a 0.4, 0.3. It's a very low impedance device. So that's why you see the line down here. But when you actually add impedance to and measure it at 18 ohms, you get a huge increase in bass. This is a very different set with more impedance. And then you're not going to probably have 18 ohms on your source device, but you may have 5 or 4 or 3. And then again, you are a much warmer, much bassier style set than people who listen to it at lower impedance or near zero impedance. So yeah, very complicated when someone is talking about that's a very warm set, a very bassy set, not a bassy set. They are hearing variations on how this one is moving and how the tuning is actually changing to whatever they plugged into it. So I think that was kind of right off the bat quite complicated. So second, EM10 does have a 5.5K little bump above the Harman target. If you are sensitive to that area, it will sound brighter than SM4. I am very sensitive to 5K. If you've watched enough of my reviews, I've complained about it enough. It's noticeable to me. It was noticeable to me right out of the box. And yeah, I would have said, yeah, right, out of the box, it's brighter than SM4. But when you kind of drill into it and say, why is it? When you look at the graphs, they're really close, and you're like, there's something going on. Go look at the 5.5 bump. And if you're very sensitive to it, it's going to saturate the treble a little bit, and it's going to sound very much like a bright spot. The perception of brightness is going to vary with each person. I perceive it as quite bright simply for that reason. 5K is just one of those areas for me that can really move tonality and balance with very small changes. And you can almost see it. You can kind of see the red poking out right there. So Harman target is right below it, and that 5K. If you're very sensitive to it, you're going to immediately notice it. If you're not sensitive to it, not going to notice it at all. But again, this is going to influence people's perception of it. Certain reviewers are more sensitive to it. Some are not. Some are not even going to notice it. Some are very much going to notice it. That is going to produce a bunch of variation in reviews. So EM10 also shifts the upper mid slightly more forward. That might sound a little bit brighter to some people, but it's really more shifted than raised. Again, if you aren't a graph person and you're just A-Bing the two sets and you're like, well, it sort of sounds a little brighter to me, Some of that is just because they shifted the mids a little bit more forward because of the dynamic driver, which we'll talk about in a second. So which one is more musical? I would say both follow Harman 2019 very closely, as I would say both are actually quite musical. I wouldn't say one is more musical than the other one. They are different flavors of each other, but I wouldn't necessarily say which one is more musical than the other one. And again, I will say very, very confusing that both of these sets are very perception dependent. How you perceive these things is going to very much influence how you describe them. So let's go back and think about this, right? You've got a set, you are a reviewer and you plug it into a high impedance set. You end up with more bass than other people are hearing, and you say it's a really bassy set, it's very warm, there's more bass than treble. It's going to influence what you heard. That's how you hear it because that's what you plugged into it. Other people are going to hear this 5.5. So now EM10 becomes a bright set, and there's some nice bass to it, but now it has this overall brightness to it. It sounds very Harman because there was a bright spot kind of right beyond the upper mids. If you hear both of these things, if you are sensitive to 5K and you plug it into a high impedance device, you end up with this very V-shaped or very U-shaped perception of it. Yeah, it's going to be very confusing how this all shakes out and how people perceive these two almost contradictory things where more bass should sound warmer and smoother, and then you get someone who says, well, I just hear this overall brightness to it and it sounds very Harman. It's going to be super confusing. So yeah, if you run across different reviews of people who are on totally opposite ends of the spectrum, this is exactly why. It's because of what they plugged into it, how they perceive these peaks, how they perceive the forwardness, the 5K, or the amount of bass that they're hearing, and how you hear those all at the same time on your tracks. Yeah, super confusing, but hopefully as you are reading reviews and watching reviews, you'll sort of remember some of these things and figure out that what that reviewer was listening to, what he may have plugged into it, will influence what he talks about. So, and also beyond that, I will say the dynamic driver part is different than SM4. SM4, like I talked about, was a quick hitter. It actually paired quite well with the other drivers. It had a really fast pace to it. EM10, slower, longer, more textures, blended better with the balanced armatures for that top of the line or mid-fi style, where there's a really nice smooth transition from bass into the mids, and I think they pulled off that better on EM10. My perception of EM10 is it's thicker. Definitely Subbass has more presence. Again, I use a low impedance device. I got about as low the bass presence as anyone does, but there is still a thickness to the amount of sub-bass. And again, that's not all that surprising. Harman 2019, it pretty much has a lot of sub-bass, not nearly as much mid-bass. It has, very little mid-bass, but a very sub-bass focused set, and that's kind of how it comes across to me. But when they slowed it down to be more an expressive is how I would call it, it definitely took on a thicker, more present for me. So the sound, I like to say it's closer to L. And again, I just sort of described, you're going to get variations of U, V, and I will call it L because I sort of took the 5.5 peak out of it and said, what does it sound like kind of straight across? And I talked about SM4 being very U-shaped, very upper mid, very sub-bass focused, very much what you would expect from Harman Target. On this one, when they slow down the bass, and again, this bass is a little bit more present, a bit more slower. It adds a little bit more warmth to it, and then that kind of tames this upper mid that you're expecting to hear from the Harman Target. The whole thing turns into a bass boosted, more neutral. There's still this little lean to it that's still a little bit brighter, but it's not nearly as much as I was expecting from a Harman Target. And that's why I will call it an L. You still have this boost out here, but you really want this to cut straight across. You don't want to hear the 5.5. If you're hearing it, change your tips, EQ, do something. You definitely want this to sound about as linear as it should be. And when you hit that point, it sounds very, very nice. But you got to recognize what's happening and what you're hearing and what you are perceiving to get that all to work out. So, like I said, still an upper tilt to it, but it's less noticeable due to the dynamic driver. It's also less noticeable because I think they're using 8 balanced armatures versus the 1 balanced armature and 1 planar. I think that combination just comes across in my ear a little bit more intense than the 8BAs do. The 8BAs, like I said, it does resemble more of a traditional 8 balanced armature hybrid style set as opposed to Quintet or even Dusk. Those had a little bit of an intensity to it that wasn't quite what you get on 8 balanced armatures. This one is very much closer to a traditional hybrid that you would find at other brands. As I was talking about the bass, there is a thickness to it, and I certainly didn't like it at first. I can appreciate what it does to the overall sound, but it tended to stick out on tracks for me. There's just too much sub bass, like pretty much all of the Cures mixed up. If you ever checked out that whole CD, there's a whole lot of bass to it, and it just stuck out. And again, on a 8 balanced armature set at a price point that this one is at, I sort of expect more balance to it. I don't want anything to stick out. And for me, right away, the sub bass stuck out in that way. And on the other hand, I will say it tries to be more expressive, more present, more stretched out. This slower bass style has more of a chance to warm up the mids than a typical Harman set, and that's exactly what it does. And if you were wondering why EM10 doesn't sound like SM4, a lot of it is how they adjusted the bass and how to add a little bit warmth to it. There's a more refinement to the mids. The whole thing sounds a little bit smoother than what you are thinking, considering they have a Harman target at, the 2019 is the foundation of what they did. But this small tweak to the bass is sort of everything on this set. The same way I said that it was everything on SM4, it's everything on EM10, but in a different style. And it was more about slowing it down, more textured, get rid of some of that Harman sharpness and leanness to it, and that's exactly what EM10 does. So why does it work? More sub bass, but overlaid with more resolution in the mids. Like I said, technically better. It could handle more bass. It could handle a little slower dynamic driver, but overlay a lot of resolution, a lot of detail to it, and the whole thing, as a bigger package, sounds really, really nice. So why doesn't it work? Again, that thumpiness that I heard on the Cure sort of became too distracting for me. So the mids, this is going to be the part that is still balanced like Harman, but I will admit, more passable if you are a lower mid and an upper mid person compared to what you are expecting from a 2019 set. But it's still a Simgot house sound, so it's still kind of balanced in that way. I will say it's better than I was expecting after listening to SM4, which I thought was too Harman. But now you have more resolution, more transparency, more reverb, more decay, just more text from 8 balanced armatures in the Harman style. I think overall, it does sound better. It definitely does sound more refined. Definitely does sound more like its price. It does sound like 8 balanced armatures. I think they got all of that right. But where EM10 flows and lingers, like on Michael Jackson's Rock With You, that was really the difference between, I would say, SM4 and EM10. There's a different pacing to the set. This slower, lingering reverb, decays, things that were much harder to hear on SM4 all come out on EM10. And that's why I really liked EM10 very much. This lingering is really, really nice compared to, I just love the way it doesn't sound rushed the way SM4 does. So, yeah, very, very cool. But do check out Michael Jackson's Rock With You. Really cool track. It was sort of the track that I used on this set, and I heard it, I'm like, oh, so that's actually what's going on. Because his voice is more expressive and stretched out, some of the instruments are the same way. When you hear that match with the pacing of the set itself, you sort of hear that natural sweet spot, and that's exactly what happens here. So slower, acoustic jazz, classical. There's definitely a pacing and a rhythm to it that sounds slower and better. And when you find the match, it's sort of right there. So treble, definitely another area where the BAs help. I think the piezo helps here. Can you put your finger on it? Probably not, but I'm sure it's doing something wonderful. And the treble here is just closer to 8BA sets. And unlike SM4, I actually prefer the levelless ones out. I think between what they did to the dynamic driver and the tuning, just having a slightly more treble forward overlaid on top of this more bass presence, I think that is what they needed. I think that's why they used that level. But I think, again, I'll say it's more L-shaped than U-shaped, less shout, less focus on the upper mids, better balance, and still aimed at listeners who still want a little bit more treble tolerance, I guess is how I'll say it. But you still have to like treble. This isn't like a super warm, dark, style set. This is still a Simgot house sound, and it's just a different flavor of it executed on really nice drivers. So it's going to sound slightly different, but yeah, it's still aimed kind of at a similar style listener. And stage, again, very much similar to SM4. So SM4 had a very Harman style stage, quite flat, and because of the balance and the treble and the bass, all that stuff is just slightly different. It actually, right out of the box, it's a noticeable difference in the stage, not as emphasized, without having that U shape that really drove the stage on SM4. Having that a little bit more relaxed and having a little bit more bass presence for a little bit more depth, you immediately know that the stage is more dimensional than it was on SM4, and it sounds less Harman. But between the drivers and the tuning, I think all those things just contributed to a better stage. So not all that surprising, but it was surprising that it worked out as well as it did. And when you start drilling into why is this set really different than SM4, it is a lot of small changes that make an overall better set and kind of what you would expect at this price point. So that being said, can we make it a slightly better set? And I'll say this is mainly going to fix or address some of the nitpicks that I just talked about. But kind of right off the bat, I'll say EM10 is very much a mid-fi sounding set, better than SM4 in the way that a 1+8 should sound better than a 1+4. More resolving, more clarity, more refined notes, more data, more information between the notes, more reverbs, more decays, no rough spots. It's really hard to hear. It's not hard to hear this with EM10. And, I would also say you can also refine and tone down the Harman 2019 out of it. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about now. But yeah, right off the bat, when you drill down and listen to the bones on EM10, there is a lot of mid-fi, maybe that is top-of-the-line style for some people, but very much what I was looking for in a mid-fi style sound, it's actually there. And this will sort of bring out some of those things. But so I kept mentioning that L shape, and I think the L shape that was my mental model on this one, and I think it's very important to adjust the sound to the L shape as opposed to the Harman for the same reason that I mentioned on SM4. The Harman doesn't necessarily bring out the best out of 8 balanced armatures or even what the SM4. It comes across as a little bit lean and a little bit too forward in the upper mids. It's a bit flatter. So when you bring out the more dimension to it, bring out some of these, reduce some of the peaks so it actually sounds a lot more L-shaped. Everything tends to be a little bit more revealing and a little bit more analog, adding more dimension to it, body to it. It just sounds a little bit closer to being there. So why L? Because also at volume scales, like your top of the line set. And you notice that right away when you start EQing this one. So I do use Foobar 2000, and these are the Foobar sliders. They are, this is -2, -2, 1, -1, and then you kind of bounce up to 2, 3, 2, a bunch of zeros, and then -1, and we'll kind of go through all these. But that's what these numbers correspond to, the value that they are at those frequency levels. So nothing too crazy. So 300 hertz is the biggest one, so that is your mid bass. That is the one I tend to use a lot for adding body to mid bass and just adding fuller mid. So that one is 3 decibels. I did 2 to the sides, but that is kind of what we'll talk about in a second, so I won't spend more time on that. But so right away, drop the sub bass. Like I said, right out of the box, a little bit too sub bassy, too thick for me. So -2, I would actually do -2 and -2. That's probably -2 and -1 the way it's shown there. But get rid of those two and move some of that thickness right into the mid bass, because this is Harman and it's a little bit lean in the mid bass. So take some of the sub bass, throw it into the mid bass, same as SM4. That extra sub bass hurts the impact, it hurts the stage, hurts air. Get rid of that unnatural drum emphasis. You can hear it on Harry Styles Golden. there's just too much out there. And again, like I said, it's quite thumpy. It gets to be quite distracting. So take some of that out of the back end, move it a little bit more forward into the mid bass, somewhere between 2 and 400, somewhere between -2 and 3 decibels, and really get those male vocals better, fill in the gap between the sub and the mid bass, have much fuller mids, and have depth on the stage. Very much like I talked about with SM4, listen for the stage to be in front of your ears. Harman style stages are very much in front of your ears. They sound flatter and right in front of your ears. As soon as you start adding mid bass, you'll hear the stage move behind your ears, and that's sort of exactly where you know you're in the zone. And again, Michael Jackson's Rock With You, a good track to play that over and over again as you're adjusting sliders, and you'll hear that happen with that track. On the treble, there's definitely a few versions of this, and like I said, depending on what your source is, depending on your sensitivity, you'll kind of want to move some of these, some of them you won't want to move. But right away, -2 dB at 5K, I am sensitive to it. 2 dB was what I needed to get it to the point where it didn't sound bright at all. It kind of fell back in line with the rest of the treble. And again, since we lowered the sub bass, we didn't really need that peak anyway. There's really no need for it. But again, you have to play with it. If you are a 5K sensitive person, you're probably going to have to move it at some point because it'll just stick out and it'll sound a little bit brighter than it really should. So -1 dB at 7 to 8. If you are a sibilant sensitive person, or you just want to prevent sibilants, I usually don't have a problem with just setting it to -1, just in case, whether you hear it or not. It tends to actually work out better, especially if you have a lot of tracks that have a lot of S's into it. It's just less noticeable if you just move it down 1 dB. But yeah, I wouldn't say this one is sibilant at all. I just did it there as a preventive measure, and I think it actually worked out well, and I kept it. I also kept 2 and 3K. Those of you who are into Harman, and you probably thought right away that was going to be the point that you were going to EQ, I'll say on this one, leave it the way it is. I tried moving it the same way I moved SM4, and I don't think it actually works out. You sort of notice the clarity and the resolution. All those things are sort of tied to something else. And moving those two was immediately noticeable that I was kind of losing resolution and clarity, and I didn't like it. So that was sort of why I had that statement right at the end in the treble section where I said I like the levels the way they were, and that's why most of these are going to be zeros, except for the bright spot at 5K, because that was the only one I really needed to move to get it to where I needed to be. So you can try 2 to 3K. I didn't necessarily like that too much. So the 15K peak, it looks like there's a 15K peak out here. Maybe that is there, maybe it's not. Maybe it bothers you, maybe it doesn't bother you. The only way to really think about 15K is to overboost it, listen to your track, drop it back down to 0, listen to your track, and then drop it 2. And one of those 3 will actually sound better to you. And I ended up dropping it -2, and that was simply because of what I just said. I had moved it up, and just to get a feel for where 15K was affecting that particular track at that point in time. And I think it was actually Michael Jackson's Rock With You, as a matter of fact. So bump it up, move it to 0, and I'll call it the frayed end effect. And if you listen like way out in the treble, in that upper treble area, maybe there's some graininess to it. Sometimes it sounds like noise. Sometimes I will say it sounds like a frayed edge. But you just drop that a little bit, and you end up with a blacker background up there in the upper treble. I think that more contrast, it sounds a little bit more refined, and I ended up liking it at -2, so I kept it at -2. So, yeah, we won't talk about this. Like I said, I actually did start out with the same EQ that I used with SM4. Definitely didn't work. It definitely sounded too muffled, lost clarity and transparency, and all those other things. So, yeah, definitely treat SM4 and EM10 tunings as 2 separate things, 2 different driver configurations. They are not going to EQ the same way as, or EM10 won't EQ the same way as SM4. You can certainly EQ EM10 and do it by ear, but don't just automatically assume that it'll be the same because the graphs were similar on SM4. They just do the same thing on EM10. Definitely not. Definitely 2 different style sets that are going to behave differently with EQ as well. So that was a long one. Thank you guys for sticking with it, and I will see you next time.